Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today. Without any further ado, let's begin with it. So today, Arthan is organizing this session on ways to become POSH compliant in a hybrid mode of working. Arthan is a social enterprise dedicated to strengthening the social impact sector in Asia through capacity building and consulting support in human capital, organizational development, and thought leadership. Arthan supports mission-driven organizations across three major domains, enabling talent, thought leadership, and capacity building. Today, we have with us our speaker and expert, Prerna Chatterjee. In a career spanning 2 decades, Prerna has worked in the field of advertising, outdoor education, research, and training. She has been working as a POSH consultant and advisor since 2015. She is also the Vice President of Maharashtra Anti-Sexual Harassment Council, WICCI. Welcome once again, Prerna. Thank you for joining this session. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Punima, and thanks everyone for joining in on Wednesday afternoon. So thank you so much. Just to add a little bit, I started my career in early 2000, and Visakhapatnam guidelines had come in by then, but there was no conversation on sexual harassment at that point of time. And very on in my career, there were many instances where I had faced sexual harassment, but there wasn't really anyone that, I could go and talk to. In some of the organization, there was no HR department. So you just had to fend for yourself. You just had to manage situations on your, on your own. So in the last 10 years of my life, I was working with Pratham. I was associated with Pratham as a consultant. And in 2015, they were putting together their policy and they were putting together a team of trainers. And I was one of them. And that's the first time it was an introduction to me on POSH, which is prevention of sexual harassment. And something clicked because as somebody who had faced, something really clicked in me. And since then, I've been working in this field. Since 2020, I've been working independently as a POSH consultant and as an advisor. And my main role is to help organizations in POSH compliances and, as well as trainings. So the idea today, in this brief sort of a session is to, because of the pandemic, we've been largely working either from home or we've been now slowly started working in a hybrid mode. So how do we, while there is an act, while there is a law and there are some mandatory compliances, so how do we really, put this together in a mode when we are sometimes working from office, sometimes working from home. There are a lot of organizations which are completely remote working. So how do you ensure compliances? So that's the idea of this session, to generate this sort of a conversation. So while there is a broad agenda for this session, the broader idea is, how do we create organizations which are POSH compliant, whether they are working full-time in person or they are working in a hybrid mode or completely in a remote working situations. So what are some of the things that can be done to ensure that regardless of the way that we are working, we're still POSH compliant? I'm going to request Purnima to launch poll 1. So basically, before I start, I just want to get a sense of who all are here today. So in case, if you're an employer, are you part of the leadership team? Are you part of HR and or L&D team? Are you an employee or others? So if you can quickly fill this up so that I will get a sense of who all are here today. Great. So we do have of the leadership team, and we've got some people who also are a part of the HR and L&D team, and there are a lot of employees. That's great to know, because you can go back to your organization and you can have a discussion in terms of how to create a more safe, inclusive environment. So this is fantastic. So my next question is, why are we even talking about prevention of sexual harassment at the workplace? Are we talking it because it's a law? Or are we talking it because every organization needs to have a POSH policy? Or are we talking because sexual harassment happens at the workplace? Absolutely. A lot of you are correct. The reason we are all here talking about this, because for all these three reasons, it is a law, which means every organization needs to have a POSH policy at the workplace. Also, sexual harassment does happen at the workplace. Just very quick teaser question. Can anybody tell me in which year this law came into being? Yes, it is 2013. This law came in December 2013. Fantastic. So we have another poll, and I'm again going to request Purnima to launch. This is the second poll for this session and the only next poll. So I will request Purnima to launch the second poll. So I want to understand, what do you think are some of the mandatory requirements under the POSH Act? It's a multiple choice. Whatever that you think is the answer, you can choose as many as possible. The actual answer is actually all of them. All of them are mandatory compliances under the law. So I just wanted to talk about this a little bit more. A lot of times the question is asked, how this act is different from WICCI guidelines. Now, when WICCI guidelines had come in 1997, those were guidelines. However, when this law came in December 2013, it was a law, which means there were a lot of mandatory guidelines that were set under this law. One of the main guidelines that was set in mandatory requirements was that the organizations have to treat sexual harassment as a misconduct, which means it's not just important that you have a POSH policy in place. It also means that you need to have other HR supporting documents where sexual harassment has been treated as a misconduct. So it could be your employee contracts, employee handbooks, service rule, code of conduct, whatever is applicable in your organization. It needs to be very clearly stated that sexual harassment is a misconduct. And if there are any allegations, the organization can take serious disciplinary action. The law is also very clear that any organization, actually it says any establishment that has 10 and more than 10 people needs to have a POSH policy in place. And this is something that I'm going to discuss a little bit more in a while. The law is also clear that every establishment needs to have an internal committee, and the role of this internal committee is to look into cases of sexual harassment. The law also talks about regular awareness sessions for both internal committee and employees. Here, I want to check, what do you think is the frequency of regular awareness sessions? What does it mean? To you, what regular awareness session means? So there are different responses that have come in. So again, the law has not clearly stated, but it's what the law is very clear about is it has to happen at least minimum once every year. A lot of organizations do this quarterly. A lot of organizations do it, biannually. But once every year for both internal committee as well as for employees, these trainings needs to take place, because this is one of the information that goes as a part of the annual report, which is again a very important compliance that every organization has to do. One of the other compliances that the organization talks about is every organization has to put these posters in the offices. And now that we are working in an online mode, a lot of our time, it also needs to go on an intranet. So these posters or notices needs to contain information on what are the penal consequences of sexual harassment, as well as the details of your internal committee members. Now, these posters should be there at your reception. If it's the office we are talking about, it should be there at the reception. It should be there in conference room, meeting rooms, kitchen, definitely in the bathrooms, because that creates a sense of privacy. So if anybody wants to reach out to the internal committee member, they don't know where to look for that information. If these posters are there in the washrooms, it sometimes becomes easier for, employees to take down that information and then reach out to the internal committee. There is also a penalty that is attached with non-compliance. So in case the organizations are not following the mandatory requirements under the law, there are penalties attached. It could be, a fine of 50,000 rupees, or if there are repeated, non-implementation, it can also result in cancellations of licenses or non-renewal of registrations. So this is why, complying with the mandatory requirement becomes very, very important, right? So I'm not going to talk a lot about this because this is not the session that we're going to deep dive into what some behaviors will be considered as sexual harassment. But I just wanted like a couple of quick responses. If you can do that in the chat box, what do you think are some of the behaviors that will be considered as sexual harassment? Okay, so I have a conversation for all of you. Uninvited messages, thanks Garima, not respecting boundaries. All right, so I have a short conversation between two people. I just wanted your quick take on what do you think about this conversation. Do you think this is sexual harassment? Yes, no, why not? Okay, so I can see a lot of people are saying yes. If you could also share, thank you so much for putting this in the chat box. If you can also share why you're saying that this is sexual harassment. Okay, so anything that makes team members uncomfortable, including non-verbal written stuff. If the receiver is not uncomfortable, reason is emojis. All right, absolutely. Because of inappropriate emojis that has been used. And also here, the choice of word dear. Here, dear has been used as a term of endearment. Now, we just have to be very clear that this is not, you know, when we are writing dear in a formal email, if I'm saying, say, dear Purnima, that's a formal email greeting. That is fine. But the moment we use dear as a term of endearment, it can become inappropriate. So this is a clear case of sexual harassment. So this is an incident that had happened last year, and this was out on LinkedIn. The reason I'm sharing this screenshot is, you know, especially now that we are working in an hybrid mode. And again, you know, a lot of organizations are continuing to work in a remote work setting. We also need to, when we are talking with our employees or when we are training our internal committee members, it's very important for them to sensitize that sexual harassment does not just happen in the form of a physical harassment, verbal or non-verbal. It is also happening in the form of, you know, there are also a lot of examples of virtual sexual harassment that has been taking place, such as sending inappropriate messages, stalking somebody online, you know, inappropriate calls late at night, forcing somebody to switch on their video, you know, and they're dressed inappropriately, taking somebody's picture without their consent. So there've been a whole lot of instances that have come out, especially in the last 2 years. And therefore, it's very important to talk about virtual sexual harassment as well when you're talking to your employees, with your staff, with your internal committee members, as well as, you know, any online medium that we are using currently, you know, and whether that falls under the ambit of workplace or not. Because a lot of times what we have been seeing is people are not coming forward to, you know, put forward their complaint because it happened over WhatsApp. And they're not sure whether this will be considered as a workplace. Can I come? Can I reach out to my internal committee? Will this be considered? Can I file a complaint? So it's very important to have this awareness amongst your employee. And we will be talking about what is a workplace, you know, especially in the current circumstance that we are working in, what will be considered as a workplace. But it's very important to include examples of virtual sexual harassment as well when you are, you know, conducting sessions for your employees. Right. I have another question. Like I said, I have many questions. I have another question. So who can file a complaint of sexual harassment at your workplace? All of you have said all of them. What if, okay, great, fantastic. So if a candidate has come to your office for an interview, I understand. What if it's a virtual interview? Will that be considered as a workplace? Can the candidate still file a complaint of sexual harassment? Yes, great, fantastic. So again, you know, this is very important to understand who is an employee, because again, when we are planning trainings, it's not just employees who are currently working in the organization, please ensure that, somebody who is on probation is also covered under the act. Therefore, they should be also a part of your training. Somebody who is on a short-term contract, they should also know what their rights are. Anybody who is working as an intern, whether they are getting paid or not is immaterial. Even if somebody is working has joined as an intern and will get a certificate towards the end of their internship, they're also covered under this act. Any housekeeping staff that you have, any support staff, they're all considered as employees under this act. So it's very important that when these trainings are designed, ensure that everybody gets included in the training. Sometimes, when I'm conducting trainings, we ensure that there is a separate training that is being organized for, say, the support and housekeeping staff, because obviously, sometimes if the training is happening in English, they may not understand. So ensure that when you are organizing the trainings are being organized in a language which everybody can understand. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. The other important thing to keep in mind is who can file a complaint at your workplace is an employee, as well as somebody who is visiting your workplace. So it could be somebody who is coming for an interview. It could be a client visiting your workplace. It could be a delivery person who is coming to drop a parcel. It could be anyone who is visiting your workplace. It could be a spouse visiting your workplace, and if they face sexual harassment at your workplace, they are covered under this law and they can file a complaint. Respondent under this act is somebody against whom the complaint has been filed. Now, I just wanted to quickly understand, in the act, and usually the terminology that we use is, we use words like an aggrieved person, aggrieved woman, or a respondent. Why don't we use words like perpetrator or a harasser or a victim? Is there a reason why aggrieved person or an aggrieved woman and respondents are used and not perpetrator, harasser? Any thoughts on that? Anybody would like to share? See, with respondent, the moment we are using words like a harasser or a perpetrator, there is already a guilt or a judgment or a label that gets attached to it. And sometimes, when internal committees are investigating, if there is already an unconscious biasness attached with the respondent, it can hinder the investigation process. Therefore, the reason we use words like respondent is because this person is responding to the complaint, right? There is a question, can only a woman be an aggrieved member? Thanks so much for this question, Radha. Under the act, only a female can file a complaint. Now, I actually wanted to ask this group, why do you think only a female can file a complaint under this act?
I think it ties to the origin of the act, the history that it comes from, the event that led to it.
Right.
So maybe that's the origin of it, but I believe that there is work being done, and also that different organizations who are working on diversity and inclusion,
right,
specifically in these instances, ensuring that all genders are included in their own organization policies, can still cover their employees.
Right. Thank you so much, Kavya. This policy is there are some other responses as well. This policy is to safeguard women at the workplace. Absolutely. So because we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to get into the genesis of the act or why this act came into being. But one big reason why the act at the moment is not gender neutral is because if we look at the statistics, largely we just have to pick up today's newspaper. Most cases of sexual violence, sexual attack, molestation, rape, such cases happens with women, right? So they are the most vulnerable, in terms of when it comes to sexual assault or sexual violence. The other reason why at the moment the act is not gender neutral is because it also covers women who are working in the informal sector. So whether it is your domestic help, domestic worker, whether it is a daily wage worker, whether it is somebody who's working in a construction site, anyone who is working in the informal sector is also covered under this act. And majority of our female workforce in India at the moment is working in the informal sector. That's, I mean, one of the tasks for all of you is to go home and talk to your domestic help if you have at home and check with them, do they know they're covered under this act? The answer may surprise you, but the reality is the act has been designed to cover them also. However, as Kavya said, a lot of organizations are moving towards a gender neutral POSH policy, which means regardless of your gender or the gender that you identify with, if your organization has a gender neutral POSH policy, everyone is covered. There are some legal implications to it, but many organizations are moving towards a gender neutral POSH policy. And I completely agree with Garima, UGC guidelines, UGC policy. So for higher educational institutes, it's a gender neutral POSH policy, which means students, regardless of the gender or the gender that they identify with, are covered under the act. Absolutely, Devika, farm laborers are also covered under this act. Any woman who is working, whether in formal or informal sector, are covered under this act. For women who are working in the informal sector, for them, the agency becomes a local committee and not an internal committee. But yes, all of them are covered under this act. So my next question to the group is, in which of the situations the internal committee has to be constituted?
प्रेरणा, आपने ये बोला कि ये जो पॉश पॉलिसी है वो बहुत सारे आजकल इंस्टीट्यूट या कंपनीज वाले लोग जेंडर न्यूट्रल पॉलिसी बनाते हैं, तो एज पर एक्ट जो है वो ये वीमेन स्पेशल है। तो ये जो भी फैक्ट्रीज या जो भी इंस्टीट्यूट ये जो जेंडर फ्रेंडली पॉलिसी बनाते हैं वो एज पर लीगल होगा, या ये जो आईसी कमेटी या पॉश जो पॉलिसी होगी उसमें ये चीज नहीं लाना चाहिए? व्हाट इज मींस आपका व्यूज क्या है इस चीज को लेके?
थैंक्स अर्पिता। सो यहाँ पे दो चीजें हैं, काफी दो तरह से मैं चीजें तरीके से मैं ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस को देख रही हूँ जो वो हैंडल कर रहे हैं। जब वो जेंडर न्यूट्रल पॉलिसीज बनाते हैं तब दे कॉन्स्टिट्यूट अ सेपरेट ग्रीवेंस रिड्रेसल कमिटी, जहां पे मेल या एनीबडी हु आइडेंटिफाइज एज अ मेल कैन रीच आउट टू देम अगर वो सेक्सुअल हरासमेंट फेस करते हैं। कुछ ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में ही मैंने ये भी देखा है कि इंटरनल कमिटीज ही हर तरह के सेक्सुअल हरासमेंट कंप्लेंट्स को लेती है, क्योंकि वो ऑलरेडी ट्रेंड होती है। ऑब्वियसली जब उनके रिकमेंडेशंस आएंगे तो वो एक्ट के अनुसार नहीं आएंगे, उनके रिकमेंडेशंस देन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन के पॉलिसीज के अनुसार आएंगे। बट क्योंकि इंटरनल कमिटी ऑलरेडी ट्रेंड है तो वो हर किस तरह के रिगार्डलेस जो भी जेंडर है, अगर सेक्सुअल हरासमेंट का केस है तो इंटरनल कमिटीज देखती है। तो मैंने दोनों तरह के सिचुएशंस देखा है। अभी तक ऐसा नहीं है, लॉ में ऐसा नहीं बोला गया है कि ऐसा नहीं किया जा सकता या ऐसा नहीं, इस मामले में अभी तक कोई नया इंफॉर्मेशन नहीं आया है। सो इसलिए मैंने दोनों तरीके से मैं देख रही हूँ कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस या तो इंटरनल कमिटीज ही हैंडल करती हैं या एक सेपरेट कमिटी बनाई जाती है अगर उनकी जेंडर न्यूट्रल पॉलिसी है। सो वहां पे वो उस तरह के सिचुएशंस को देखते हैं। राइट, डज दैट हेल्प अर्पिता?
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for your...
Except for one, in all other places, IC has to be constituted because the law is very clear. Any organization that has 10 and more than 10 employees needs to have an IC. And that's why I had discussed who can file a complaint, an employee as well as somebody who is visiting your workplace. So even an organization jahan pe sirf 25 employees hain, even though all are male, they still will need to have an IC because ho sakta hai, anybody who is visiting the workplace, if it's a female and if they face sexual harassment, they have the right to file a complaint. So except for one, all three will have to constitute an internal committee. In situation 2, organization has one branch in Delhi with 200 people. So wahan pe ek committee hoegi. Bangalore, because only has 9 people, so wahan ke liye special separate IC nahi banegi. They can reach out to their IC that has already been constituted in case an incident happens in Bangalore. In the last situation, technically all 5 locations needs to have an internal committee, because all 5 locations, the employee strength is 50. So as per the law, all 5 locations will need to have an internal committee. Now, यहाँ पे one question was कि एक तो first situation में क्या होएगा जहाँ पे 9 employees हैं, and what is a local committee? So, सबसे पहले तो we have to understand what is an internal committee. So, internal committees are constituted within the organization to look into cases of sexual harassment. Now, generally, internal committee में 4 लोग होते हैं, जिसमें से 50% have to be female, and उसमें एक presiding officer होती है जो हमेशा senior female employee होगी. Now, local committees are also the local committees, their function is exactly like the internal committee. However, local committees are constituted at district level. So every district in India needs to have a local committee. Now, their role is to look into cases of sexual harassment faced by women working in the informal sector. So informal sector में जो भी महिलाएं काम कर रही हैं, अगर वो sexual harassment face करती हैं, so they can reach out to the local committee to file a complaint. And for us, they have a relevance because any organization जहाँ पे 9-10 से कम लोग काम कर रहे हैं, and वहाँ पे अगर इस तरह का कोई incident होता है, then they also reach out to the local committee to file a complaint. So I hope that answers very briefly answers the question on local committee. I'm just going to also quickly check some questions. The act allows for transgender women to file a complaint. Yes, the act allows that. So this brings me to another important question is, what is a workplace? What will be considered as a workplace? So again, there are 5 situations that are given here. What do you think will be considered as a workplace? Okay, fantastic. All of it will be considered as a workplace. Before I answer this further, I think there is a question by Himanshi. What if there are no women in the factory who can be designated as a presiding officer? Great question, Himanshi. Generally, we look at sister concerns if there is a partner organization, because the law is very clear that the presiding officer only has to be a senior female member. So in case the organization does not have a senior female member, or if there are only male members, they often reach out to their sister concern or a partner organization for the time being, until and unless, till the time they, have a senior female member in the organization. So often then that's an alternative that they, choose. Absolutely. So this is again something we have to keep in mind when we are conducting trainings and when we are talking to our employees is, what is a workplace? So again, the law is very clear, and over the years, many case laws have come that have also expanded our understanding. So workplace is not just our physical office premises. Workplace is anywhere that we are visiting for work. It could be a meeting, it could be attending a conference, it could be an offsite, an office party, it could be going to a government office, meeting with the सरपंच, आप field survey कर रहे हैं, वो सारा आपका workplace बन जाता है. यहाँ तक कि even if you're taking any transportation for work, चाहे आप बस या train से कहीं जा रहे हैं काम के लिए, वो भी आपका workplace बन जाता है. And lastly, in the last 2.5 years, because we've been working from home, there's a lot of online work that is happening. So anything that we are doing in an online space, your Zoom, MS Teams, Google Meet, Slack, WhatsApp, emails, SMS, calls, all of that becomes a workplace. So again, this is very important to convey to your employees in the organization that workplace is not just the physical office premises. Workplace is any medium that you're using for work, right? There is maybe constitute the IC less than 50% women member. No, Himanshi, you can't, because the law is again very clear. You have to have minimum 50% women members. So for example, if there is a 5-member team, you have to have 3 members who are women. Right. One of my last questions for, this session is, so who is impacted by incidents of sexual harassment at the workplace? Aapko kya lagta hai? Is it the individual? Is it teams or organization? Okay, mostly individuals, all Absolutely. So I want to understand from the group, how teams are impacted by incidents of sexual harassment. How do you think it impacts the team? Absolutely. There is shame, there is guilt. It impacts team morale, bonding gets impacted. The aggrieved movement is a part of the team, and if she's uncomfortable, that will affect her work. Absolutely. Eventually, team performance or team bonding as well. The work atmosphere gets negative. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Any other thoughts? How does it impact organization? Absolutely. The way the complaint has been handled affects how safe an employee may feel, a reputation risk, brand image. Absolutely. So it's not just about the individual, because at individual level, there are so many ways in which, the individual is traumatized. There are psychological, emotional, and mental impact of sexual harassment, but it also impacts team. Like all of you have said, it impacts productivity, it impacts performance, it has an impact on team morale. It also results in increased absenteeism. It creates a toxic work environment. So there are a huge reasons, like huge ways in which also it impacts team. It also has a huge impact on the organization, the brand value of the organization. It has a huge impact on the brand value of the organization. Think of sexual harassment cases and, Uber or Infosys. There have been instances where, it has impacted the stock prices of the organization because of sexual harassment cases, So there is also a financial impact. In fact, if a couple of years ago, in Australia, Deloitte did this survey, and they found out that the organization suffered $2.6 billion because of loss in productivity. So there is a huge financial cost when it comes to, sexual harassment. So it is not just about the individual. And therefore, the reason I'm talking about this is compliance is a big part of the act. And the reason we are here talking about it is because of the compliance, but it also has a big impact on the overall culture of the organization and, how others view your organization. And especially in a social media age where everybody is talking about every organization on LinkedIn, it becomes very critical to ensure that your workplace is safe and inclusive for all the employees that are working, in your organization. So this brings me to the last couple of points is then what is the role of the employer to ensure that you're complying with the law? One of the main roles is to ensure that you're formulating and disseminating your POSH policy. Oftentimes I've seen, the POSH policy is created in English. A lot of times people may not understand, they may not be comfortable with English. So it's also important that when you're creating your policies, also create that in Hindi and vernacular languages, and not just share it, when say somebody is joining, or put it on intranet. Ensure that you're regularly sending these policies to your employees. You can send it by emails, have it on the website, have it on the intranet, have it at a place which is easily accessible by all the employees. The other thing is constitute internal committee members. Ensure that there is a good mix of people in your internal committee. While it says it has to have 50% women, also ensure that they are men. And, if you have people who identify with LGBTQ community, have those representation as well, as a part of your internal committee. Because the more diverse your internal committee will be, it will also help in the investigation process. Again, the other responsibility of the employer is to display penal consequences of sexual harassment. So these are the posters, notices that I was talking about in the beginning. Again, ensure that these posters, these notices are not just in English. They're also there in Hindi, also there in vernacular languages. If you have offices across India, the main aim is that people should be able to understand. Right? Again, because we are working in a hybrid mode, don't have these posters just in the offices. Share these posters regularly with your employees. You can, whatever medium that you're using, if you're using Slack, maybe have a regular, quarterly send these posters to your employees, put it again on intranet. Again, it needs to be easily accessible to your employees, regardless of where they are working, whether they are working online or offline, it doesn't matter. That should be easily accessible to them. Again, regular orientation of employees and ICs. I can't emphasize on this enough, because what we are talking about is behavior change. So, and a lot of times, it's not going to happen over one training, over a 2-hour session. It has to be a constant conversation. Again, the main important role is whatever medium that works for you, whether it's virtual, whether it's in-person training, ensure that you're having these conversations with your employees. Make sure that it becomes a part of your training module. Even if you're able to insert some small capsule of it, do insert it. Ensure that you're doing these trainings, conducting these trainings in a language that everybody can understand. Again, go back to whether it's Hindi or vernacular languages, in whatever medium that your people can understand, ensure that you're conducting those trainings. Train your ICs, because they are the ones who will be investigating their cases. So it's very important that you invest time and energy in training your internal committee members. They need to understand what are the different aspects of the whole redressal mechanism is, what are the different things to keep in mind, what are some of the challenges that can come in, both again in an online, because right now what is also happening is a lot of investigations are happening virtually. So what are those things to keep in mind when you are conducting virtual investigations? So ensure that all of this becomes a part of your training module when you are training your internal committee members. And along with that, also ensure that your internal committee is meeting every year. They can meet virtually, they can meet in person. Again, whatever medium that works best for them, ensure that they're meeting every year, every quarter, or if not quarter, at least once in 6 months, because it's important that they keep having these conversations. If there is a case, can they discuss that? If there are any behaviors that they have observed, again, those that can be a part of the meeting. So ensure they, that your internal committees are meeting regularly. If you have your branches in any of these places, it is Mumbai, Noida, Karnataka, or Telangana, it is also important that you have to register your internal committees there. At the moment, these are the only 4 areas where these notifications have come out. So ensure that your ICs are registered with the district body. Another important responsibility of the employer is to provide necessary facility to the internal committee members to ensure proper investigation. So whether it is any sort of logistical support, it is the duty of the employer to provide that support to the internal committee member, whether again it's virtual investigation or in-person investigation, whether it means the IC members have to travel, all that logistical support has to be provided by the employer to facilitate that process. Lastly, it is the role of the employer to take action on the recommendations that has been made by the internal committee. Oftentimes I've seen that the employers, try and influence the decisions of the internal committee members. They can't. Their role and their duty is to act on the recommendations of the internal committee members. I'm going to take some questions in the end. This is one of the last things that I wanted to talk about. This is something that I've already covered. These are some pointers to keep in mind. We are in the last quarter of this year. One of the main compliances of POSH is to submit an annual report, and that is submitted for every IC that you have constituted. So for example, in your organization, if there are 3 different ICs that has been constituted at 3 different locations, the annual report for each of these ICs will have to be submitted in those respective districts. Now, this exercise happens in the month of Jan of every year for the previous calendar year. So for 2022, it will take place in Jan of 23, which means only we are left with very little time, because this is also a festive season. So ensure that you're complying with what are the mandatory requirements given under the law. Ensure that your organizations are complying with. If there are any trainings left, ensure that you are planning those trainings, in the next couple of months. If you have a POSH policy, need to review it, ensure that, the policies have been reviewed. So these are some of the things that you need to keep in mind to ensure that you are complying with, the law, and as well as creating a safe workplace. All right. So on that note, I am going to sort of end my discussion, but I'm going to now open it for questions. So there are any questions, I'm happy to take as many questions. We still have some time. So I can see there are a few questions that have already come in. Does a company registered in Gurgaon register with the Noida district body? No, Radha. Gurgaon has not taken out a notification as yet. So this notification has come out only for Gautam Budh Nagar, so which is Noida. So for Gurgaon, I'm not sure, unless you also have a branch in Noida, or if your IC has been constituted in Noida, then that's a separate case. But for Gurgaon, there has been no such notification as far as I know. What is the equivalent of displaying POSH policy in a virtual environment? Kavya, you can share, ensure that you're sharing the POSH policy. You can do that via email with all the employees. Ensure that it's somewhere on the website which can be easily accessible by the employees, or if there is an intranet, ensure that it's there on the intranet, so again the employees can refer to it whenever it's possible. But the easiest thing is send your POSH policy to all the employees. You can do it via email as an official dissemination. Just send a copy to all the employees, a copy of your POSH policy. If there is a new startup with less than 9 employees and incident happens with the candidate or any stakeholder, where should she file a complaint? Parul, in this case, the case will go to the local committee where the incident has taken place. So you will have to figure out in which district, and then you'll have to find out the details of the local committee, and that's where the complaint needs to be filed. Alternatively, she can file a police complaint as well. This is something that we need to know, that sexual harassment is also a criminal offense. So if the complainant chooses, she can also file a police complaint under this law.
मुझे ये पूछना है कि बहुत सारे फैक्ट्री वाले लोग जो है वो 3 months में जो मीटिंग करवाते हैं वो वर्चुअल करवाते हैं, इट्स ऑनलाइन. So it's absolutely fine. Means we conduct as an external person, conduct the meeting in online setup.
Absolutely. In fact, मैं पिछले 2.5 साल से I think 95% of my sessions have been online only. क्योंकि अभी भी बहुत सारी संस्थाएं ऐसी हैं, बहुत सारी ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस ऐसी हैं जो पूरी तरह से ऑफलाइन मोड में नहीं गई हैं. सो ये सब तरह से अभी चल रहा है. सो व्हाट इज मोर इम्पोर्टेंट है कि आप ट्रेनिंग कराइए. अगर ऑनलाइन करा रहे हैं दैट इज ऑल्सो फाइन. इनफैक्ट अभी बहुत सारी ट्रेनिंग्स ऑनलाइन ही चल रही हैं.
कि जैसे आपने बोला दो फैक्ट्री ऐसा है कि जहाँ पे फीमेल एम्प्लॉय नहीं है, पूरे यूनिट है जहाँ पे आपको सिंगल सीनियर कैटेगरी में आपको भी नहीं मिलेगा. तो ये सिचुएशंस में जब हम बोलते हैं कि चेयरपर्सन जो है वो फीमेल होना चाहिए, तो उसमें कोई एक्सटर्नल पर्सन चेयरपर्सन बन सकते हैं या बाहर से कोई लोकल कमेटी को कैसे में अप्रोच कर सकते हैं?
जनरली जितना अगेन मेरे को पता है कि इन ऐसी स्थिति में जनरली अगर हेड ऑफिस में कोई सीनियर फीमेल मेंबर्स हैं तो उनको चेयरपर्सन या प्रिसाइडिंग ऑफिसर बनाया जाता है. या अगर फैक्ट्री की कोई सिस्टर कंसर्न है या पार्टनर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है, सो वहां से किसी सीनियर फीमेल मेंबर को प्रिसाइडिंग ऑफिसर बनाया जाता है. सो जनरली जितना मेरे को पता है ये किया जाता है फैक्ट्रीज के सिचुएशन में जहां पे महिलाएं नहीं है, कोई भी वर्कर महिलाएं नहीं है या उस फैक्ट्री में कोई भी सीनियर फीमेल महिला नहीं है. तो जनरली हेड ऑफिस या मेन ऑफिस में अगर कोई है तो उनको प्रिसाइडिंग ऑफिसर बनाया जाता है.
So I just want to know that as per law it has been mentioned that कि अगर 3 years तक कुछ आता नहीं है, उसमें केस नहीं होता है, तो इंटरनल कमेटी कैन बी डिस्क्वालिफाइड, उसको कंसिडर किया जा सकते हैं. So इसमें क्या?
हाँ, So may I just very quickly, I will answer your question कि आप internal committee को disqualify नहीं कर सकते हैं. जो ये 3 साल का time है is the tenure of the internal committee. मतलब कि 3 साल के बाद आप इस internal committee को आप discontinue कर सकते हैं, but you will have to constitute a new internal committee. So just because case आया नहीं है उसका मतलब ये नहीं है कि internal committee at any point of time can be disqualified. It only means that this 3-year time period is the tenure of the internal committee. Another question is it must to have an IC for an organization which is having less than 10 full-time employees, but having, so Swati, when you're looking at employees, that will include full-time interns, part-time consultants. And the moment this number crosses 10 and more than 10, means you need to have an internal committee. So it doesn't mean that only when you have 10 full-time employees is when you have an IC. Employee definition itself means that if you have full-time, part-time consultants, short-term consultants, interns on probation, the moment your number in a branch or establishment becomes 10 and more than 10, you need to have an internal committee.
IC also mentions, I think we need to have an external member
Yes.
in the, okay. So now who can this external member be? Because we have an internal committee, but we don't have any external yet in our organization.
Okay. So every internal committee does need to have an external member. And this external member is somebody who is working in this area, who is either a POSH expert, may not be a lawyer. So the law is not saying that it has to be a lawyer. It may not be a lawyer, but somebody who is familiar with the law and somebody who is working in the area. Again, somebody, it could be a POSH expert. It could be somebody working in organizations who are working on women's rights, is aware of the law. So think of somebody who is already working in this area, who has that expertise, and so those are the kind of people that you can think of.
Thank you so much, Prerna, for sharing such insights with all of us, and thank you to our wonderful audience for joining in and for keeping the session so interactive. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. And as Purnima said, for participating and, making this an engaging dialogue. So thank you so much, everyone.